Silence is not the wound. Silence is the mask the wound wears when it no longer trusts anyone to see it. Somewhere behind the calm face of the person who pushed you away, there is a version of them still screaming, and no one has ever heard it, not even them. This is the part nobody tells you about avoidant collapse. It does not look like breaking. It looks like nothing at all. A flat expression, a closed door, a person who seems from the outside completely fine. But underneath that stillness, something is caving in, slowly, silently, in a place words are not allowed to reach. And here is the question that should disturb you. What if the silence was never about control? What if it was never a weapon at all? What if the very moment an avoidant pushes an empath into quiet, something inside the avoidant begins to die first, long before the empath even notices the distance? There is a hidden collapse happening behind closed emotional doors, and almost no one is talking about what it actually means, or why it happens, or what it reveals about the architecture of the human need to be loved without being seen. There is a myth that avoidance is strength, and it is one of the most dangerous myths in modern psychology because it convinces both the avoidant and everyone around them that withdrawal is a sign of control. But control born from fear is not control at all. It is a performance of safety staged for an audience of one. The avoidant person did not learn to walk away because they are powerful. They learned it because somewhere in their early development, closeness became associated with danger, and the nervous system does not forget a lesson like that. It encodes it, it builds architecture around it, and that architecture becomes the entire personality, mistaken by the world and often by the person themselves for independence. Empaths, on the other hand, carry a different kind of architecture, one built not around escape but around absorption. They do not run from emotional intensity, they drown in it, quietly, while smiling on the outside. Most people assume the empath is the healthier one in this dynamic, the more emotionally intelligent one, the victim of someone else's coldness. This assumption is comfortable, but it is incomplete, and incomplete truths are the most dangerous kind because they let a person feel morally superior while remaining psychologically unexamined. The empath's compulsion to understand everyone, to forgive too quickly, to interpret silence as a puzzle rather than a message, is not purely virtue. It is often an old survival strategy in disguise, formed in a childhood where love had to be earned through emotional labor, where being needed felt safer than being chosen. Here is the first hidden truth almost nobody names correctly. Avoidant collapse is not caused by losing the empath. It is caused by losing the last person willing to witness them. Human beings do not actually fear abandonment in the way pop psychology describes it. They fear something more specific and more devastating, which is becoming invisible. An avoidant can survive being alone. What breaks them internally is the moment they realize no one is watching anymore. No one is decoding their silence. No one is translating their distance into meaning. The empath, for all their exhaustion, was performing an unconscious function the avoidant never admitted needing, which was interpretation. When that interpreter walks away, the avoidant is left alone with a version of themselves they do not know how to read. This is where the collapse begins, not loudly but underneath, like a structural failure in a building that still looks intact from the street. The avoidant may appear unaffected for days, weeks, sometimes months. They may even feel a temporary relief, mistaking the absence of conflict for peace. But peace and numbness are not the same experience, even though they can feel identical from the inside. Numbness is what happens when the nervous system runs out of strategies, and an avoidant who has finally succeeded in pushing someone into permanent silence has, in effect, run out of the one strategy that always worked before, which is distance as a form of communication. Consider a second hidden truth, one that unsettles the entire foundation of how people discuss detachment. Avoidance is not the absence of attachment, it is attachment turned inside out. A person cannot fear closeness unless closeness once meant something to them. The coldness is not proof that they never cared. It is often proof that they cared too early, too intensely, in an environment that punished that intensity. Every time an avoidant creates distance, they are not proving indifference. They are performing a ritual of self-protection so old that it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like identity. And identity, once mistaken for protection, becomes almost impossible to question, because questioning it feels like questioning survival itself. Now examine what happens to the empath in the same silence, because their side of this collapse is equally misunderstood. When an empath is pushed into quiet, something strange and rarely discussed begins to occur. Instead of losing hope immediately, many empaths experience a distorted form of clarity, where the silence becomes a screen onto which they project meaning that was never there. They replay conversations searching for the exact sentence that caused the retreat. They construct entire psychological narratives to explain someone else's withdrawal, often more sophisticated and more generous than the avoidant's own understanding of themselves. This is not weakness. It is a mind trained since childhood to find the emotional truth beneath silence, because in their early life, silence from a parent or caregiver was never neutral. It was a signal that required urgent decoding to stay emotionally safe. Here is where the deeper irony reveals itself, sharper than most relationship content is willing to admit. The empath's gift for reading silence is precisely what taught the avoidant it was safe to remain silent. Every time the empath filled the emotional gap with patience, forgiveness, or premature understanding, the avoidant learned, without ever consciously deciding it, that withdrawal produces no real consequence. Why change a pattern that keeps being absorbed and softened by someone else's compassion? This does not mean the empath is to blame for the avoidant's behavior. It means both people were unconsciously training each other in real time to repeat a cycle neither of them designed on purpose. Two nervous systems shaped by two different wounds, accidentally reinforcing the exact behavior that was slowly destroying them both. There is a moment in every collapse that reveals character more accurately than any conversation ever could, and it is the moment right after the silence finally breaks something in the avoidant. Some avoidants respond to this internal collapse by reaching out, but not out of love. They reach out because the silence has become unbearable evidence of their own emotional architecture, and reconnecting feels like the fastest way to escape facing that architecture directly. This is one of the most misunderstood behaviors in modern attachment psychology. A sudden return is often mistaken for growth, when in reality it can be nothing more than the nervous system searching for its old regulator, the person who used to absorb the chaos so the avoidant never had to face it alone. And this is precisely the crossroad where self-respect becomes not an abstract virtue but a psychological necessity. The empath who has finally gone quiet stands at a decision point that will shape the next decade of their emotional life, whether they realize it or not. If they interpret the avoidance collapse as proof of love, they risk stepping back into the same architecture that taught them their worth was measured by how much distance they could absorb without breaking. But if they understand the collapse for what it truly is, a nervous system in crisis rather than a heart in transformation, they gain access to a form of clarity that most people never reach, because it requires separating compassion for another person's pain from responsibility for fixing it. This is where a harder truth needs to be spoken plainly, even though it will not feel comfortable to hear. Self-respect is not the act of proving you can survive without someone. That is merely endurance, and endurance alone has never healed anyone. Self-respect is the refusal to keep translating someone else's fear into a language that excuses your own erasure. The empath who finally stops interpreting silence as a puzzle to solve is not becoming cold. They are becoming whole, because wholeness requires the ability to witness pain without immediately absorbing it as a personal assignment. Notice something almost no one points out about avoidant collapse, which is that it rarely happens in isolation from a much older collapse the avoidant has been avoiding their entire life. The relationship did not create the fracture. It only removed the final distraction that had been covering it. Many avoidants build entire identities around competence, independence, and control, specifically because those traits allow them to avoid confronting an earlier version of themselves, often a child who learned that emotional need led to punishment, disappointment, or abandonment. When the empath leaves the room, so to speak, the avoidant is no longer performing strength for an audience. They are alone with the original wound the performance was designed to hide. Consider the paradox hiding inside this entire dynamic, because paradoxes are where the deepest psychological truths tend to live. The avoidant desperately wants closeness but experiences closeness as danger. The empath desperately wants safety but experiences chaos as familiar, even comforting, because chaos was the emotional weather of their early environment. Two people, each chasing the exact thing their nervous system has been trained to sabotage. This is not a story about incompatible personalities. It is a story about two forms of childhood adaptation colliding in adulthood, each one convinced it is protecting itself while quietly recreating the very pain it is trying to escape. Here is a third hidden insight rarely discussed in mainstream psychology content, and it concerns the empath specifically. Many empaths do not actually fall in love with the avoidant as a whole person. They fall in love with the potential version of that person, the one who might finally open up if given enough patience, enough understanding, enough emotional generosity. This is a subtle but critical distinction, because loving potential instead of reality creates a relationship with someone who does not yet exist. The exhaustion empaths feel after prolonged silence is not only grief over losing a partner, it is grief over losing a version of someone they helped imagine into being, a version that may never have been real to begin with. Do not mistake this observation as cynicism, because understanding this pattern is what finally allows an empath to love clearly instead of hopefully. Hope, when misapplied to another person's unfinished healing, becomes a quiet form of self-abandonment. It asks the empath to keep investing emotional energy into a future that depends entirely on someone else's willingness to change, a willingness that cannot be earned through patience alone. Real transformation in another person is never something you can love into existence. It is something they must choose, alone, in a moment you will not be present for and cannot control. There is also a psychological mechanism at work inside avoidant collapse that deserves closer examination, something behavioral scientists sometimes call delayed emotional processing. Avoidants often do not feel the full weight of a loss in real time. Their nervous system delays the emotional signal, sometimes by weeks or months, as a protective measure against being overwhelmed. This creates a strange and often painful timing mismatch. The empath feels everything immediately and intensely, while the avoidant feels almost nothing until much later, often after the empath has already moved into acceptance or detachment. By the time the avoidant's delayed grief finally surfaces, the person who once represented safety may no longer be emotionally available to receive it, and this mistiming is one of the quiet tragedies embedded inside almost every avoidant and empath dynamic. Think carefully about what this timing mismatch reveals about human connection in general, not just about romantic relationships. People are rarely ready to feel what they need to feel at the exact moment it would matter most. Growth almost always arrives late, inconvenient, and slightly too far behind the event that triggered it. This is not a flaw unique to avoidance. It is a universal feature of how trauma interacts with time. The nervous system protects itself first and processes truth second, and that gap between protection and truth is where most human suffering quietly accumulates. Now turn attention toward a deeper philosophical layer beneath all of this, because psychology alone cannot fully explain why this collapse feels so significant to those who experience it. At the center of every avoidant and empath cycle sits a single unresolved question about identity, which is this: can a person be loved for who they actually are, or only for who they are capable of pretending to be? The avoidant fears the answer is no, so they withdraw before anyone gets close enough to test it. The empath fears the answer is no as well, so they overextend themselves, hoping that enough devotion will finally prove their worth is unconditional. Both people are running from the same existential fear using opposite strategies, and neither strategy actually answers the question they are both terrified to ask directly. This is why the eventual collapse, when it finally happens, carries so much weight. It is not simply the end of a relationship. It becomes, for both people, a referendum on whether they are fundamentally worthy of being loved without performance, without earning it, without controlling it. And this is precisely why healing from this pattern requires something far more demanding than moving on or finding someone new. It requires each person to sit alone with that original question long enough to answer it for themselves, independent of whether another person ever validates the answer. Examine what happens to a person who spends years mistaking hypervigilance for intuition, because this is precisely the trap many empaths fall into without realizing it. The ability to sense a shift in someone's tone, to notice the smallest change in energy before a word is even spoken, feels like a gift, and in many ways it is. But this same sensitivity, when it develops as a survival mechanism rather than a conscious skill, can quietly become a prison. The empath begins to organize their entire emotional state around monitoring someone else's internal weather. Their peace becomes conditional. Their nervous system stays partially activated at all times, scanning, predicting, adjusting, long before they consciously decide to do any of it. This is not empathy in its healthiest form. This is empathy hijacked by fear, wearing the costume of emotional intelligence. Few people ever ask what silence actually does to the person creating it, because most conversations about avoidance focus entirely on its effect on the other person. But silence is not a passive act for the avoidant. It requires constant internal maintenance. Every unanswered message, every unspoken feeling, every moment of distance has to be justified internally over and over to prevent guilt or longing from breaking through. This is exhausting work, even though it looks like nothing from the outside. The avoidant is not resting in their silence. They are laboring inside it, holding a wall in place that requires more energy to maintain than most people realize, because the moment that wall drops even slightly, everything they have been avoiding comes rushing in at once. Consider a strange and rarely discussed possibility, one that challenges the common narrative entirely. What if the avoidance collapse after prolonged silence is not primarily about missing the empath at all, but about confronting the terrifying discovery that distance did not actually protect them the way they believed it would? The withdrawal was supposed to create safety. Instead, it created a hollow, directionless kind of freedom that feels closer to abandonment than liberation. This is a devastating realization for someone who built their entire identity around the belief that independence equals invulnerability. The collapse, then, is not grief over losing a person so much as grief over losing a belief system that no longer holds up under pressure. Now consider the empath's parallel discovery, because it mirrors the avoidance in an unexpected way. Many empaths discover, often for the first time in their lives, that silence does not actually destroy them the way they always feared it would. For years, they may have believed that withdrawing from conflict, disappointing someone, or setting a boundary would result in catastrophic abandonment. This belief likely formed early, in an environment where love felt conditional on constant emotional availability. When the empath finally survives their own chosen silence, when they discover that stepping back does not end their existence, something fundamental shifts. They begin to separate their worth from their usefulness. And this separation is one of the most quietly revolutionary moments in a person's psychological development. Here it becomes important to challenge a belief most people hold without question, which is the idea that emotional maturity means always choosing connection over distance. This is not universally true. Sometimes distance is the more mature choice, because it protects a person from repeating a pattern disguised as compassion. The empath who finally allows silence to exist between themselves and an avoidant partner is not abandoning empathy. They are redirecting it for the first time toward themselves. This redirection is often mistaken for coldness by those who benefited from the empath's previous self-neglect, but redirection is not coldness. It is the long overdue correction of an imbalance that should never have been normal in the first place. There is another layer beneath this dynamic worth examining closely because it touches something larger than any single relationship. Human beings often confuse intensity with intimacy, the emotional highs and lows created by an avoidant and empath cycle. The pursuit, the retreat, the reconciliation, the collapse can feel like proof of deep connection simply because the nervous system is so activated throughout the process. But intensity is not the same as intimacy. Real intimacy is often quiet, steady, and undramatic, which paradoxically can feel less alive to someone whose nervous system has been trained to associate love with unpredictability. This is why some people, after finally healing, describe a stable relationship as boring in the beginning before eventually recognizing that boredom, in this context, is simply the unfamiliar sensation of safety. Think about what this reveals about the broader human relationship with suffering itself. People frequently mistake familiar pain for meaningful pain, assuming that if something hurts deeply, it must matter deeply. But pain is not always a measure of significance. Sometimes pain is simply a signal that an old wound has been reopened by a new situation wearing a familiar shape. The empath who suffers intensely during an avoidant silence is not necessarily suffering because the connection was profound. They may be suffering because the situation activated an older, unresolved wound that has nothing to do with the specific person standing in front of them. This brings forward a fourth hidden psychological insight that deserves direct attention because it is almost never discussed openly. Both avoidants and empaths often unconsciously choose partners who reflect their unresolved relationship with their own emotional needs, not their partner's actual character. The avoidant does not choose distance because empaths are inherently overwhelming. They choose distance because closeness of any kind eventually triggers an old alarm system unrelated to the specific empath in front of them. Likewise, the empath does not stay in painful silence because this particular avoidant is uniquely worth the suffering. They stay because the pattern of proving their worth through endurance feels psychologically familiar, almost like home, even when it is slowly destroying them. Once this insight is fully understood, something remarkable becomes possible, which is the ability to finally separate the relationship from the pattern. This does not mean every avoidant and empath relationship is doomed, and it does not mean two people cannot heal alongside each other, but healing cannot happen while either person is still operating from the original wound without awareness of it. Growth requires a moment of brutal honesty where each person stops asking what the other person did wrong and starts asking what unresolved fear they themselves brought into the relationship long before they ever met. This question is uncomfortable, but discomfort is often the exact signal that real transformation is finally within reach. Someone reading this right now already knows exactly which side of this pattern they live in, and pretending otherwise is the last defense mechanism standing between comfort and change. Stop waiting for silence to prove something it was never designed to prove. Stop mistaking endurance for love and distance for strength. The only way out of this cycle is to turn inward, name the original wound honestly, and choose growth even when no one is watching and no one will applaud it. Do that today, in private, without needing anyone's permission or witness, because in the end, the people who break these patterns are not the ones who finally get chosen by someone else. They are the ones who finally choose themselves fully, quietly, and without apology.